Made with Spoken. Never to be Solved. By Steve Higgs. Digital narration performed by narrator's custom voice, Hume. I lit a cigarette and smoked it in the cool air outside the fire escape. I wasn't supposed to, but it was my last day, so what could they say to me now? I'm not a smoker. This case always made me agitated, though, so when I found an old pack of cigarettes in my drawer, I used them to distract me for a few minutes. Every detective I know has a cold case or two that they either just cannot let go of or has come by through bad luck or poor timing. Most of them don't get solved, and this one was no different. I had been working on it for 29 years. Picking it up when I had time and ignoring it when I didn't. I inhaled the foul smoke deeply, holding it in while I remembered the glorious blue sky when I went to the victim's house that June day. It was early summer in 1995. I had been promoted to Detective Sergeant 5 weeks earlier and felt on top of the world. I had studied for those exams with more effort and concentration than I had ever put into anything in my life. I had ignored my wife for weeks in the build-up, which infuriated her, but I had achieved the highest exam score in the country, something that netted me an award, a mention in the Police Gazette, and a promising career, the only thing I wanted in life. I promised Sarah I would make it up to her. Promotion meant better pay, and I was on my way up the ladder. I remember that she seemed distant, though, distracted by something else that at the time had been a mystery to me. When the call came that June day, I was just arriving at the station and had been walking past the dispatch desk. There was a dead body that sounded distinctly like a murder. The police department in the sleepy coastal town of Herne Bay only warranted 2 detectives, and I was the junior one, but we were of equal rank now, and Dave was already out investigating a sexual assault. I remember running to the superintendent's office to let him know there was a possible murder and to volunteer to head the investigation. Murder in Herne Bay is rare, so this was a prime opportunity to make my name, make my move, if you will. That was how I sold it to the boss, but he dismissed me in his usual gruff manner as if it was obvious I would be taking the case, and my presence in his office was wasting his time. It's such a long time ago now, but still so fresh in my head. I heard movement behind me, the sound snapping me back to reality. Someone would notice the fire escape door was not fully closed, my foot was in it, and they would come to investigate. I took one last puff and dropped the butt over the railing. It fell slowly, leaving a near-invisible trail of smoke until it hit a puddle and vanished. Checking the coast was clear, I slipped back inside and returned to my office. There on my desk, next to the cardboard box in which I had placed my few sad personal belongings, was the Ratty old case file. In it were my handwritten notes, photographs, statements, and everything else I managed to amass over almost 3 decades. The once sharp corners of the cardboard outer file were worn away, and sun had bleached the cover where I had once left it on the windowsill for an entire year. I slumped into my worn office chair, turned the file to face me, and flipped the cover open. Stuck to the inside cover was a 6x8-inch photograph of the victim. A head and shoulders shot his parents, supplied at my request. It too was ratty and worn. I thought back to 1995 when they tearfully handed it over. That was the 2nd day of the investigation. They lived in Chichester and were too far away for me to get to any sooner. By the time I inadvertently heard about the discovery of a dead body, a squad car had already been dispatched to the scene. A co-worker had gotten curious about the victim's absence from work and chose to investigate. Peeking through the letterbox, they spotted the badly beaten and very bloody body of Bruce Denton laying on the floor of his house, and made the emergency services call that I overheard at the station. What the uniforms found after their forced entry was a man who had been brutally murdered in his own home. Bruce Denton had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt weapon, a baseball bat or something similar in what the coroner described as a frenzied attack. His autopsy revealed there were very few bones left that were not broken. The department's meagre resources were dispatched to assist me. Even Dave turned up a few hours later with no trace of the betrayal I would have felt had he snatched the case instead. More officers came in from Canterbury to reinforce our numbers and help with both the door-to-door questioning and our hopeful yet fruitless search for the murder weapon in the nearby park and river. The investigation proved to be frustrating rather than the triumph I foolishly promised the superintendent. Of the killer there was no trace, no fibres, no hairs, no footprints outside the house, no fingerprints, nothing, nor could any motive for the attack be found. He had no gambling debts. Neighbours reported few visitors to his house, no steady girlfriend, and no late-night noise. We interviewed his work colleagues, friends, and relatives, revealing very little in the process. He had a half-empty packet of condoms in the top drawer next to his bed, and a receipt for them was found in his trash to show they were less than a week old. Trace fibre and hair from a woman were found at his house, in the shower drain and in the bed. However, in the 3 decades since, I am yet to produce a woman to match them. There was a breakthrough late on the first day when knocking on doors brought me into contact with Harold Smith, just a few doors away from the victim on the other side of the road. He was a hulking bear of a man who clearly used his size to intimidate his wife, and was anything but pleased to find me in his kitchen questioning her when he got home from work. He was generally threatening and had to be subdued, and then arrested when he overreacted upon learning that I had an officer upstairs talking to his pretty 16-year-old daughter. The daughter seemed far more upset than the death of a neighbour warranted, and it had made me suspicious. However, I doubted she would open up to an older man, so I sent a young female constable to talk to her quietly, girl to girl. Constable Lucy Beaton proved to be quite tactful. The victim was in his late 20s and very good-looking. Was he involved with the girl? Was it her hair in his shower? Had that been motive for the overly aggressive Mr. Smith? It all sounded quite convincing, though ultimately it proved to be a dead end. The girl simply had a teenage crush, and while that might have caused Mr. Smith some irritation, he was oblivious to it. I wasted many hours questioning him, yet in the end he was released with a caution, and I was back to having no leads at all. We discussed at length how the killer might have managed to leave no trace of himself. A profiler from London even graced us with his presence. I had to keep my mouth shut while he prattled on in a lecturing tone, telling us that the man was most likely well-versed in police procedure and very possibly a serving or former cop or someone with connections to us. I joked aloud that we should all submit ourselves for questioning. It got a laugh, but the profiler with the impressive university education clearly wasn't impressed, as I found myself giving the superintendent a good listening to later that afternoon. I went home in a bad mood that night to find Sarah was out. There was a note on the fridge written in a terse rather than loving tone, which led to a fight when she got in slightly drunk a few hours later. My anger pushed me to demand where she had been, and the conversation went downhill from there. She threatened to leave me, and regretfully I scared her when I quietly told her we would never be parted. I meant it, even though it was not my intention to express it in such terms. It had the intended effect, though, I suppose, as we are still together now. Sighing contentedly, I closed the file and thought about my wife. I knew of other chaps who retired looking forward to being at home more, only to find their increased presence exposed holes in their marriages that resulted in divorce only months later. It would not happen to me. I loved Sarah more than I could express. I would do anything for her.
Hey, Tony, everything all right?
The voice broke my train of thought and snapped me back to reality. I looked over to see Steve Miller, the other detective sergeant in the department. He was just shy of 30 and very much the man I was at his age. Yes, Steve, everything is just fine. I'm packing up my last few bits.
Could you give the place a clean before you leave?
He was joking, of course, a little banter. He was inheriting the office from me the same way I came by it 15 years ago when Dave retired, and I assumed the role of senior detective. I smiled at him to show I appreciated the joke, but I didn't reply.
Would you like me to drop that old thing down at the archive for you?
He asked, aiming an index finger at the case file. No thanks, I might as well make one last trip. Steve nodded and left me, heading to the coffee machine. Today was a day of lasts. Last trip to the archive. Last day as a cop. Last time I would get a cup of coffee from the coffee fund I paid into. More than 30 years behind me, so many cases, so many busts, and a few disappointments too. None of it mattered now, including the unsolved murder case and the victim, Bruce Denton. What was it that the old superintendent said at the time? Oh yes, get it done, Barclay. Persistence is the key. His words echoed in my mind now and dragged me back to 1995 again. There had been so little to work with. No one saw anything. No one knew anything. And the only clue that emerged was that 3 different neighbours recalled seeing a car parked near the victim's house in the days leading up to the murder. Each person reported seeing a man in the car, but while the description for the car was never the same, and the description for the man was likewise always different, none of them could remember a number plate, but one believed the last 3 letters might have been FUN. They remembered it because it spelt a word. The vehicle registration database revealed more than 200 cars in a 10-mile radius with the same last 3 letters. I chose to not pursue that particular lead. The days began to stretch out, and to my surprise, I was not held accountable for the lack of progress. Not at that point. The superintendent leaned on me to keep at it. The killer was considered to be a wily foe, and he believed my persistence would eventually succeed. His opinion was on the money. On the 8th day, I went back to the street, once again going door to door. After 2 hours of the same answers I got every time I spoke to the neighbours, I got something new. The couple at number 53 gave their eldest son a camcorder for his 18th birthday. That was a month ago. 2 days later, toying around with the camera outside their house, the boy, Simon, caught a 10-second clip of the victim getting out of his car with a woman. Bruce took her into his house. I watched the footage with rapt fascination. Over and over, the focus of the lens was on Simon's motorbike, not the couple, but they were there in the background, and I was willing to bet the tech guys could improve the quality and make the woman's face discernible. It was a real lead. With it, we might identify the victim's lover, and then the case could open right up. I took the camcorder as evidence, much to Simon's disgruntlement, and sealed it inside an evidence bag. An hour later, I found myself mumbling in front of the superintendent's desk. I had to tell him that when I took the camcorder, I headed directly to the station, or at least, that had been my plan. Low on fuel, I stopped off on the way. Queuing to pay, I was stuck behind a little old lady who was having a natter with the equally old lady behind the cash register. In the end, I had to clear my throat loudly to get their attention. When I got back outside, the first thing I saw was my passenger's door ajar. The superintendent remained silent while I explained my utter incompetence. I failed to lock my car, and the camcorder was no longer where I left it. In losing it, any hope of analyzing and refining the picture to identify the woman was snatched away. In the embarrassing aftermath, the case went cold. That I could not solve the case and lost the one piece of evidence that might have identified his killer could have been forgiven in time, but the case made the national headlines in a slow news week. Not only was my incompetence public knowledge, the press were using the case to batter the wider police community in general. My colleagues were verbally forgiving to my face. They said it could have happened to anyone and that I had been unlucky, but I knew they held it against me. Honestly, I was grateful just to keep my job. Weeks went by while I continued to question the same neighbours and co-workers. I showed Bruce's picture around at local restaurants and pubs in case the victim and the mystery woman had ever been spotted together. The weeks stretched into months and new cases took priority. The months stretched into years, but I kept the case file on my desk and went back to it every time things were quiet. Each time I came back to the case, I looked for new leads. I re-interviewed the neighbors, several of whom moved away in the prevailing years, and would ask if they remembered anything about the woman that might prove useful, or if they recalled seeing her before or had bumped into her since. I was certain she was local and still living in the area. No one ever had anything for me, and after so many years I felt sure her appearance would have changed to the extent that she would be unrecognizable. The teenage girl with the crush on the victim grew up. I spoke with her again just last week. Now in her 40s, young Poppy's prettiness had developed into mature beauty. She was married with 3 children, but she could shed no further light on what might have happened to Bruce Denton. Bruce was an only child, and his distraught parents were both now deceased. I was glad because it meant I no longer had to visit them and dredge up such awful memories. The net result of my years of questioning the same neighbors and co-workers and friends showed only that no one remembered anything of worth. Worrying whether the killer would ever be caught used to keep me awake at night. It still did occasionally, but not very often anymore. Others have asked me why I keep the case file in my office and why, after so many years, I cannot let it go. The answer, which I will never share with them, is a simple one. If I have the case file, then no one else does, and therefore no one else will ever investigate it. This is important to me because I killed Bruce Denton. He was sleeping with my wife. 2 weeks before his death, I randomly popped home one day to surprise my wife at lunchtime. I had not done so for a very long time, and I bought flowers and hoped I could show how much time I spent thinking about her, even though I knew I was failing to show it. As I came into the house, I opened my mouth to call out, but the sound caught in my throat. I could hear her moaning upstairs as the bed creaked rhythmically. When Bruce Denton left an hour later, I was watching, and I followed him home. I watched him for the next 2 weeks, checking the street on which he lived, noting his movements, and making sure I knew the location of every camera that might record the street. CCTV was less common in 1995, but it did exist. On my wife's keyring, I found a key I could not identify. It opened his front door as I suspected it would. From work, I took a forensic suit, mask, gloves, and boots. The baseball bat was something I had in the garage. It hadn't been touched in years. After the event, when I was bathed in blood, the forensic suit and other bits went into the incinerator at work designed for exactly that purpose, and the bat was in a bog where it would not be found for many millennia. The camcorder was next to it. The man Bruce's neighbors saw sitting in his car was me. Knowing my surveillance was a risk, I wore disguises each time and took different cars from the pool at the station so no one would ever see the same man in the same car twice. The FUN registration was my own, which is why I didn't follow it up. It was the only time I truly thought there might be a way to link it all back to me. I simply failed to file those reports, though, and I have deflected any reference to the man in the car whenever it has come up with interviewees since. Killing Bruce Denton was easier than I expected. I was so damned angry. Sarah suspected me. I could see it in her eyes that night when we fought. She heard the truth of his murder in the way I promised we would always be together. She has never asked me about it, though, and she has never tried to leave me. Our love is forever. With a smile on my face, I popped the case file under my right arm and headed down to the archive. If ever there was a case that was never to be solved, it was this one.
Steve Higgs is a former British Army officer and an engineer by trade. He was largely disinterested in every subject at school with the exception of creative writing, for which, at the age of 10, he won his first award. However, it wasn't until the twilight of his Army career that he began to write books. Initially, this was to exorcise the belief that he could do it. Yet he quickly discovered that not only did he enjoy the process, but that words would flow from his fingers onto the page in a seemingly never-ending stream. Steve Higgs is a former British Army officer and an engineer by trade. He was largely disinterested in every subject at school, with the exception of creative writing, for which, at the age of 10, he won his first award. However, it wasn't until the twilight of his Army career that he began to write books. Initially, this was to exercise the belief that he could do it. Yet he quickly discovered that not only did he enjoy the process, but that words would flow from his fingers onto the page in a seemingly never-ending stream.
The end. We hope you've enjoyed this production of
Never to be solved. Made with Spoken.
Professional audiobooks in a click. Spoken.